Hi, everyone. Looks like giving everybody a couple extra minutes to get started here. Let's begin. Before we jump into the technical content itself, just want to remind everyone that you are welcome to add any questions or clarifying comments that you want in the little chat bubble that's up at the top. We'll get to questions at the end of the webinar session. Thank you all for taking the time today to sit with us and join another episode of our webinar series on why vulnerability management matters. We're doing this in partnership with Tenable. As we mentioned in previous episodes, Tenable is a leader in this space, and although the content here is not intended to be Tenable specific, a lot of the things that they do really well are reflected in this presentation. So. Thanks to Tenable for partnering with us on this, and looking forward to walking through this with you guys. So again, just to clarify here, there is that little chat window in the top of the webinar here. So if you have anything that you want to share, please do so. We are also recording this series. So once that has been edited and is ready to go, we'll be posting it along with our previous two episodes as well. So a little bit about me for those who haven't joined on our previous episodes. My name is Mitch Kelsey. I'm a cybersecurity advisor here with CDW Canada. I represent our risk advisory services practice in Western Canada. So in my day job, I help organizations design programs related to risk advisory, consulting, all of our offensive security engagements, so our penetration testing practices, as well as our vulnerability management services. I am CDW Canada's Tenable Guardian. I get the opportunity to get a deeper level of training and an understanding of what's new and coming in the vulnerability management space, which I'm very fortunate to do. I came to information security a little bit different than others on my team in particular. I came from a national security and intelligence analytics background. And so when I think through cybersecurity issues, I always think about them, as they relate to other parts of your security and general business operations efforts. And I like talking about systems. So that's definitely reflected in this series. And when I'm not talking about cybersecurity, and when we're allowed to do so, you can find me playing soccer, cooking in the kitchen, spending time with my wife, two little boys, and my bulldog. Like many of you, today is a work from home day for me, so you may hear one of the little ones. So I'm sure there'll be a little bit of that on conference calls in the near future. So just to review what we covered in the previous two episodes, a little bit of a recap here just to catch everybody up and remind you, what we're here to talk about. So in the first episode, we talked about breaking down what a vulnerability is and why it's important to understand different aspects of it. So we talked about how organizations calculate risk, understanding on the asset side of things, how to understand what is important to the business and how you are able to determine that, and then also what goes into prioritizing vulnerabilities? What have been some historical ways to do that? What are some recommendations going forward? And using that discussion to answer a couple of key questions. As an organization, are we prepared? Are we at risk if there is a vulnerability in our environment, and what can we do about it? We walked through a couple of examples of organizations that have faced breaches and some of the responses that came from that. In the last episode, we talked about some of the newer domains that vulnerability management is playing a part. We talked about IoT and operational technology spaces. We also talked about the SDLC and cloud assets and how vulnerability management works in those spaces differently. So both of those episodes are available on CDW Canada's YouTube channel. So if you wanted to catch up, you weren't able to attend previous ones, you're welcome to do so. So easiest way to get there is through the CDW Canada channel and then to the video section. They should pop up. Let's cover quickly what the agenda is for today's discussion. So I wanted to focus today's discussion, given that we're looking at how you can leverage vulnerability management to enrich and contextualize other parts of your security and business operations practices. And so to do so, we're going to break down at first, what the meaning of intelligence is and how to understand the intelligence lifecycle. And then specifically as it relates to vulnerability management intelligence, what are some of the ways that that integration happens? What is intelligence? Understanding the process of taking data about your environment to intelligence, it is cyclical, but it also involves taking the requirements that an organization needs to be able to make a critical decision into account to help filter and select the type of data that you have about your environment to then understand the best way to process and exploit that data and turn it into information. And then as an organization, understanding what pieces of information can be operationalized to help make that decision. And that's really where you get to the point that you're talking about intelligence. So it's not only a drilling down of some of the data sets that you have in your environment, but it's also what's important to help you make that decision and being able to, to separate what may be extraneous to that decision point. So the intelligence lifecycle. We talked a little bit in the first episode about how vulnerability management fits quite nicely into the Deming cycle. So that effort of making a plan, executing on the plan, checking the status of how that plan is working, and then acting on the results of that plan. So it's definitely a cyclical circumstance. So as it relates to the intelligence cycle, right from the beginning, understanding, what is the objective, what's the answer that you're looking for to help design the question to be able to understand and pull in the information that you need. So once that direction has been set, then you need to understand how you're going to collect the data that you need to make that decision. And there's things that you need to keep in mind about that collection process in terms of what sources you're going to use and how that data is going to be normalized across them, the scope in terms of how wide a net you have to cast, as well as the time sensitivity, how quickly we need to make this decision and how much of a trend are we able to review to do so. And then also how confident we are in those data sets, understanding what may be more difficult to understand because maybe there's some sparse information on a subject or the reliability of that data for your particular purposes might not be there. And that's an important thing to understand. Processing that data to help select what's going to be meaningful, to understand what's relevant, to understand how reliable it is over a time period and how you're going to collect and store it. Then you take this to the process of that analysis and exploitation, which we talked about. So understanding what's significant in that, your ability to answer that question, understanding the implications of different data set relationships and how they integrate with each other and some of the other decisions that you may need to make, how they're collateralized and what patterns may emerge from that analysis. And then it's important to also understand who the audience of this intelligence is going to be. A very technical audience may require something that's very specific and detailed, that's formatted in a way that they can ingest, perhaps to put into another system or to inform a process in a very specific way, where others within the organization, so business leaders, need a different type of information. They need to understand, the consequences of something, but also they're being able to ingest that information as part of a larger strategic discussion. So the format's important. Also, how quickly do you need the information, and where's that line between providing something quickly to answer a question and providing something that's meaningful. So sometimes that striking that balance is important. And then the very most important part about all this is once that question has been answered, taking a chance to reflect on this process and understanding, is there a way that we can improve with the new information that we have going forward? how do you apply intelligence in your environment? So in most circumstances where you do have to make this sort of critical decision, you're not going to have all of the information that you need. And the balancing act, in an operational perspective is understanding, when do I have enough information to go on? What do I need to know once I have this information? What's the next step here? What is it important that I rely on? What is trustworthy that is going to be the foundation of my decision? And what are things that I can ignore either because they're extraneous or because they're considered to be not necessarily, it's good information to understand, but may not drive the complete decision. All these things are good questions to answer as part of that effort. So how can you leverage vulnerability management intelligence in your environment? We're going to break down a couple of examples here. 4 key areas that vulnerability management can certainly help outside of the day-to-day practices that you would have for its own purposes. First one, well, actually, the first 2 here are related to incident response. So vulnerability management in many senses is a proactive control that as much as possible, being able to properly harden the systems that you have when new vulnerabilities occur helps protect you from the potential of an incident. That being said, there are circumstances that come up that you need to do so more quickly than you would otherwise. And it does bleed into what you would consider an incident response effort. So vulnerability management intelligence can play an important role in conducting these proactive and incident response preparations. Some of you may be aware, I believe there's now a name for this vulnerability. I think it's called eternal darkness. But there was a vulnerability that was disclosed last week, CVE 2020-0796. It's a SMB share volume or version 3 remote code execution vulnerability. So you can think about previous ones like Eternal Blue, that was the underlying vulnerability we talked about in previous episodes that got leveraged in WannaCry and NotPetya attacks. This is a little bit on those lines. It's just an updated version that's affecting Windows 10 systems. So up until last Thursday, there wasn't a patch available for this. So we knew that this vulnerability existed. It had been disclosed by Microsoft. But because of how previous vulnerabilities that were similar to it had been exploited quite quickly, people were under the assumption that this one was going to be similar. So up until very recently, being able to understand what to do about this vulnerability, you weren't going to be able to apply a patch because that didn't exist yet. So it was important to understand in this particular case, what are the other mitigating factors that we have here? What are the other things that we can do? So in this particular case, Microsoft had recommendations that they've made for other SMB-related vulnerabilities as a best practice, that you have this visibility in your environment in terms of which assets may be affected and what is exposed in your network. You can be proactive in hardening yourself. So in this particular case, being able to restrict that traffic as much as possible to within your network, and only allowing inbound and in other cases outbound traffic to your domain controllers and your file servers to a range of trusted hosts is a recommendation there. So that's something that to help your team prepare for potential exploitation here, getting an idea of which ports are open, inbound and outbound on your perimeter is one aspect of this. And then also just understanding, which assets are needing to be able to connect to those file shares and understanding that in advance of something bad happening. On average, a threat actor these days has at least a 5-day head start when it comes to, formulating an attack. So anything you can do, especially when a critical vulnerability like this is disclosed, can buy you time to prepare yourself even when a patch is not available. So just to review what that lifecycle looks like, identifying systems that may be affected by a potential vulnerability. That includes not only your endpoints, like these Windows 10 systems we talked about, but also how they would be exploited within your network. So in this particular case, understanding what ports are open, and making decisions to help restrict, potential dangerous traffic. Review that threat and ensure that you have a plan for how to address that, especially when you're facing a new type of risk to the business that you may not have seen before. Ensuring that you know as an organization how you're going to tackle it if something does happen is really important. Then go through the effort of taking remediating action. So now that there's a patch available, making sure that it's rolled out, as soon as is possible for your team, but also looking at some of those other things outside of the specific patch to make sure that you're safer than you were previously. And then also ensuring once you've taken those actions, make sure that they stick. Make sure that that patch doesn't break. Make sure that there aren't any other additional requirements that you may have. In many circumstances, particularly on the Windows side, for these critical patches, when you roll them out, you not only have to patch the systems, but you also have to make sure that you're setting registry keys and things like that. So ensuring that you're actually protected is really valuable. And on the same side, if you're going to be changing rule sets to restrict what traffic is available to access your network, make sure that actually works. You can change the rule sets, but funny things happen with that logic, and making sure, because you've rescanned to check those systems, is valuable. That's proactive incident response. There are definitely circumstances where you have to speak to this in a reactive circumstance, and vulnerability management intelligence can help here as well. So if you have the ability to understand a threat actor's attack path, you have some indications of compromise and you have some visibility into what has happened, you can identify which systems may be vulnerable and may be targetable, that an organization, the threat actor is going to look at to be able to attack your environment. So particularly looking at systems that may be targeted for pivoting within your network, establishing persistence, or elevating the privilege, or other techniques that certainly are out there. So if you know the vulnerabilities that you have on the assets in your environment, you can understand what is exploitable and what you need to look for when you're performing incident response at the detection and analysis phase, as well as how to confirm that hardening effort had been done and that the threat has been contained, eradicated, and recovered from. Helpful. This allows you to know what you need to update, isolate, or kill to shut down that attack and prevent a reinfection. Vulnerability management itself is not the only tool that you're going to leverage in this, but particularly when you're looking at a known exploit, being able to ensure that those systems are hardened so that you don't get reinfected is an important part of that effort. So the other tools in your environment are going to lead this effort. So your SIM, your endpoint or network-based detection and response capabilities, your security operations or orchestration and automation and response capabilities are going to lead, but you can pull vulnerability management data into that process to be able to assist. That's going to do everything from helping you understand what the risk as part of this effort is, but it's also a two-way street. You can leverage those tools to kick off scans to make sure that that you have updated information on those vulnerable assets and help you understand what you need to do to take those next steps. So another area that is where vulnerability management can be helpful is when you're confirming your posture and compensating controls across your network, and when you're talking about specific assets. So there's a couple of different ways that this happens, and these are two examples. When you're talking about giving access to an asset, whether it's a service account, whether it's an endpoint, whether it's other assets, or elevating a privilege for some specific purpose, providing context to those actions can really help better secure those efforts, particularly to prevent a potential attack from happening. There's kind of two primary ways that this occurs on networks. One of them is related to network access management, so brokering an asset's ability to connect to the network. So understanding the hygiene of assets that are looking to jump on your network is helpful. If somebody has their work laptop that hasn't been powered on in a while and is missing some critical patches, or has been traveling to an area that you think it might be infected in some way, being able to check that out before you provide that access is important. And that's something that integrating vulnerability management into that brokerage can help you with the information that you need to make that decision. Also helps with reinforcing those tolerance levels. So you can, you can tell your users that you have certain expectations of them, but you can also validate that with technical data. When you're talking about elevating privilege, privilege access management solutions can certainly help to augment authentication you have in your environment and how you're handing out privilege for specific functions that you have. And being able to interrogate the security of those hosts that are making requests to elevate their privilege can certainly help. And understanding that the context of why and how that host is asking for elevated privilege is important. And depending on your understanding of what that asset does in your environment, and this goes back to the discussion of how critical that asset is, what is it doing, what's it designed to do in your environment, you can validate whether or not this privilege escalation makes sense. It may not make sense for a finance laptop to be running PowerShell as an admin. That's useful information to have. And if you have that visibility because you have a clear understanding of what your assets are doing from a discovery perspective, and you know what they're expected to do, then that can help you make that decision. So I want to take the opportunity here, specifically related to privilege escalation, to talk about an area that in and of itself is potentially not as high a priority with organizations, just given the fact that it is local to the machine. But local privilege escalation vulnerabilities are a great example of why giving that vulnerability information to a broker to be able to allow an asset to escalate its privileges is really helpful. So this is a quick breakdown of a recent local privilege escalation vulnerability. In this case, it affects the Solaris product line. It's a buffer overflow vulnerability. So as you can see, the exploitability score for it is quite low. And the reason why is because it requires local access to a host. So in many circumstances, if you can't get your hands on the machine, you're not going to be able to exploit something like this. But tied with other vulnerabilities in your environment where there may be some other way for a remote attacker to be able to connect to that machine at a lower privilege. If this local privilege escalation vulnerability also exists, then that user, because they've remoted onto that machine with lower level privileges, would be able to exploit this to escalate their privilege. And now it is no different than it would be if it were a remote execution vulnerability like the one we talked about previously. So this is a great example of if that host was looking to escalate its privilege, and this vulnerability exists on that machine, that tells you a lot about the risk of that asset accessing certain things in your environment that are going to be critical to you, and it is likely going to affect the way that you make that decision. So in this particular case, there's mature exploit code that's available on ExploitDB, and if you already have local access to, or you already have access to that machine in some other way, now it's like I said, it's no different than if you could remotely execute code. Speaking of vulnerabilities that may already exist on hosts, using vulnerability management as part of your general IT operations practice when you are building new configurations is helpful. So integrating this with your asset and configuration management efforts provides another view of assets in your environment from a discovery perspective. This is not directly security related, but can be helpful to validate that you have the hosts that you expect that you own in your environment are the ones that are actually visible. So cross-referencing this to make sure that that number is similar is important, both in terms of assets not being there that you expected to see, but also hosts that you didn't expect to see that have popped up on your discovery scans that you didn't know about is important as well. This also helps you when you're benchmarking the security of builds, when you're rolling out new assets, that these align with your best practices for configuration. So you can benchmark assets against CIS standards to ensure that they're appropriately hardened, and being able to do this across a large asset population can be a lot easier than having to try and do that manually and interrogate that based on a configuration profile. By conducting vulnerability management and integrating that into your workflow early allows you to test that build and ensure that it is going to meet those expectations before deployment. I'm sure many organizations right now are facing challenges with dealing with an increasingly remote workforce, people having to work from home more often. And before shipping out a laptop, making sure that everything is configured the way that you expected it to is really important because availability of remote machines can be further compromised when you're talking about remote workers, and sometimes those fixes can be pretty difficult. So as much as possible, if you can prevent that extra work from happening later by validating the configuration changes that you're making before you roll those machines out, can save you that time. Additionally, something that we talked about a little bit earlier, but integrating your vulnerability and change management practices can help get your IT operations and security teams on the same page. So not only are the teams that focus on different aspects of this able to work within their own tool sets because you're able to integrate them, it also has that common two-way communication with expected outcomes. So because you confirmed the details of what's meaningful between the two teams. So for example, a workflow when Patch Tuesday comes out to identify those critical vulnerabilities that are going to get rolled out with the next patching cycle to the IT operations team, being able to integrate with the ticket management system that the IT ops team is using to be able to do so allows them to track in their own systems what they need to do and in what priority. But then also, once those patches have been applied, being able to kick off those scans the other way and ensure that that everything was rolled out the way that it was intended to, and that something didn't break in the process. This is a good time to remind what we were talking about a little bit earlier at the beginning of this episode about that new Windows 10 vulnerability, and understanding that now that the patch is available, and that hopefully you've been able to apply it as widely as possible, but confirming once you've done that you can validate that those other steps have been taken. So this is certainly a circumstance where you would want to ensure that you've taken the effort to harden those assets, you've taken the effort to restrict access to your network. You want to make sure that that's working properly, particularly with a vulnerability like this, with an increasingly remote workforce right now. People do need access to those SMB shares and other authentication services that are going to associate with that. Making sure that that's done safely is something you definitely want to validate. So lastly, we want to talk a little bit about critical change. So in the previous episode, we talked about vulnerability management and some of the newer domains. And critical change, as you'd imagine, is a commonality across organizations, but it does look very different in different contexts. And integrating vulnerability management intelligence into your change control and QA processes for these different types of activities is going to look different, but it can help provide that context that you don't have just from the one tool set alone. Helps you validate those assumptions and identify insecure or misconfigured processes earlier, or if there's vulnerabilities baked into something, that you have that visibility. So as an organization, when you're making a major network change, understanding what some of the impacts of that may be from a hardening perspective can be helpful. You can do that in production, once that change has already happened, and you should. But you can also do the research in advance so that you understand, what the impacts may be from a configuration and vulnerability perspective to help inform that decision making in the design phase. Similarly, when you are developing applications, confirming as early as possible that you are doing so in a secure way can save you a lot of time. Because as we talked about in the previous episode, vulnerabilities in terms of application development are just bugs. They are security bugs, but they're bugs nonetheless. And so the earlier a bug is introduced in that software development process, more time it's going to take to remediate down the line. And so integrating vulnerability management, whether it is code analysis, whether it is hosting infrastructure assessments. So you can think of some of the newer deployment mechanisms like Kubernetes, being able to confirm that vulnerable libraries or other sort of misconfigurations aren't being baked into those containers before they reach production, but also testing your applications in production to make sure that the vulnerabilities that may have been introduced in code are remediated, but also if there's a new vulnerability that's found that you didn't know when it was in development, that you can affect that as well. We talked about what asset deployment and modification looks like from a vulnerability management perspective a little bit already, but just stressing the value of having that insight into how secure the configurations that you're applying are to new assets before they're deployed can, again, save you time and ensure that you have a more secure asset population. And another area that is increasingly a challenge for organizations is confirming the security of your third-party vendors. So in many circumstances, your vendor partners will need access to some aspect of your network, whether you're using their solution as part of your business operations, whether they're helping to support some function and need certain access to your network. Ensuring that that's done safely is important. And part of that is going to be technical in that you're able to run scans against those assets or those services to ensure that they're meeting your standards. But it also works on a policy level as well to be able to require those security assumptions about these vendors when you make the decision on who you'd like to work with. And having vulnerability management integrated into that process helps you ensure that the partners that you're looking to work with are meeting their obligations and they're working with you securely. So that's the end of the content here. Wanted to just say there's going to be one additional episode of this webinar series that's going to be coming up this summer. We're going to be looking to upcoming changes in the vulnerability management space and how we're going to continue to evolve our understanding of this going forward. I do want to reiterate the fact that as one of my key areas of focus personally, and something that CDW Canada does for many of our customers, we can assist with the deployment, implementation, design, operations of vulnerability management, particularly as it relates to Tenable in a number of different ways. We have a managed service that we can help organizations to cover that scanning frequency that you expect. We also have a professional services team that can help with some of those integrations that we talked about to ensure that you can leverage vulnerability management data as best as you can. And my risk advisory services practice can also help with tying the technical content that you're going to get from a vulnerability management system and align it with some of your other security practices. So not only talking about, assessing that posture, but also being able to bubble up this to a more strategic risk conversation. Just want to thanks again to Tenable for helping to sponsor this series, and open it up to questions in case anybody wanted to talk about anything in particular here.
Thanks, Mitch. There are no questions from our attendees, actually. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I am certainly available, as well as your CDW account management team. If this sparked something for you and you'd be interested in talking further about this or any of our previous episodes, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to help. Thank you all for taking the time today to join us in this third or fourth episodes on why vulnerability management. I hope you have a great rest of your week.